The gaslight flickered against the brick tenements of Atlanta's Fourth Ward, casting trembling shadows across the narrow alleyway where Emma Lou Sharp made her final walk home. It was 11:30 on a humid September evening in 1911, and the city's working-class neighbourhoods had settled into their restless sleep. Cotton mill smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of magnolia and something else. Something metallic that made the night feel different, dangerous. Emma's footsteps echoed softly against the cobblestones as she hurried past the darkened doorways, her shawl pulled tight against the unseasonable chill. Behind her, another set of footsteps kept perfect rhythm with her own, always maintaining the same distance, never quite catching up but never falling behind. She had noticed them 3 blocks ago, near the trolley stop, and now her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The gaslight ahead sputtered and died, plunging the alley into velvet darkness. In that moment of blindness, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant whistle of a freight train carrying cotton toward the Chattahoochee River. Emma never saw the shadow that moved behind her, swift as smoke, quiet as prayer. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the Ward. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to when gaslight flickered against brick tenements, and the air carried the weight of cotton dust and coming storms. I am your bedside historian, here to guide you through the darker corners of our past, where forgotten stories wait in the shadows of memory. Wherever you find yourself tonight, perhaps in a comfortable bed with rain pattering against your window, or in a quiet room where the only sound is the gentle hum of distant traffic, take a moment to settle in. Whether it's past midnight where you are, or the early hours when the world feels hushed and distant, you've found sanctuary in this space between waking and sleeping, between the present and the past. If you're new to these midnight wanderings through history, please consider subscribing to this channel. Each gentle press of that button helps our little community of night listeners grow, bringing more souls to gather around these old stories that deserve remembrance. Your support keeps these forgotten tales alive in the darkness. Now, let us step backward through time, to September of 1911, when Atlanta was a city balanced on the edge of the modern world, where electric streetlights fought nightly battles with gas flames, and the Old South was giving way, slowly, reluctantly, to something new. The autumn of 1911 had settled over Atlanta like a fever dream. The city, still rebuilding itself from the ashes of war nearly half a century past, stretched its growing limbs toward the sky with an ambition that belied its provincial roots. Downtown, the newly completed Candler building rose 16 stories into the Georgia sky, a testament to Coca-Cola money and New South aspirations. Electric trolleys sparked along their wire-strung routes, carrying clerks and mill workers from the expanding suburbs to the heart of commerce. Yet for all its modern pretensions, Atlanta remained a city of neighborhoods, each with its own character, its own secrets, its own shadows. In the Fourth Ward, where the working class made their homes in narrow shotgun houses and brick tenements, the night carried different sounds than those heard in the grand mansions of Inman Park. Here, the whistle of freight trains bound for the Chattahoochee River mingled with the distant clatter of machinery from the cotton mills that never seemed to sleep. The air hung heavy with humidity and industrial smoke, a metallic taste that coated the tongue and made every breath feel substantial. Emma Lou Sharp had grown accustomed to these night sounds, these night smells, during her 18 months in Atlanta. She had arrived from the mountains of North Georgia in the spring of 1910, another young woman drawn by the promise of steady work and city wages. At 19, she possessed the kind of quiet prettiness that mill supervisors notice but rarely remarked upon. Dark hair pinned modestly beneath her hat, eyes the colour of a winter sky, hands already showing the calluses of honest labour. She had found employment at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, one of the massive brick structures that anchored the city's industrial district. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, she stood before the great looms, her fingers dancing between the threads with practiced precision. The work was hard, the air thick with cotton dust that settled in her lungs and clung to her clothes. But the $8 she earned each week was more money than she had ever seen in her mountain village. Emma had taken a room in a boarding house on Auburn Avenue, a narrow 3-story building that housed a dozen other mill girls and shop clerks. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a washstand and a trunk for her few belongings, but it had a window that faced west, and in the evening she could watch the sun set over the city's growing skyline. Mrs. Henley, who owned the boarding house, was a widow from South Carolina who maintained strict rules about visitors, curfew, and proper behaviour. No men above the first floor, lights out by 10 o'clock, and church attendance every Sunday morning. Emma found the structure comforting after the chaos of her departure from home. She had left the mountains under circumstances she preferred not to discuss, carrying only what could fit in her trunk and a letter of introduction from her former minister. On the evening of September 23rd, Emma had worked later than usual. A shipment of cotton had arrived late in the afternoon, and Mr. Patterson, the floor supervisor, had asked for volunteers to stay and help process it. The extra hours meant extra wages, and Emma rarely turned down the opportunity to add a few more coins to the small pile she kept wrapped in a handkerchief beneath her mattress. She had dreams of saving enough money to attend the commercial college downtown, to learn typing and stenography, to escape the mill's endless mechanical rhythm. By the time she left the factory, the sun had long since disappeared behind the western hills, and the gas streetlights were beginning their nightly vigil. The trolley that normally carried her home had stopped running its evening route, leaving her to walk the 1.5 miles through the Fourth Ward's maze of narrow streets and alleys. The walk was not unusual. Emma had made it many times when work ran late, or when she chose to save the nickel trolley fare. She knew the route by heart, east on Decatur Street past the small shops and saloons, north on Auburn Avenue through the heart of the neighborhood's commercial district, then the final turn into the residential streets where working families had made their homes. What was unusual on this September evening was the figure that seemed to be following her. She had first noticed him near the trolley stop on Decatur Street, a man in a dark coat and hat, standing beneath a gas lamp as if waiting for someone. Nothing suspicious about that. Men waited for trolleys and friends and sweethearts every evening throughout the city. But when Emma turned north on Auburn Avenue, she caught a glimpse of the same figure in her peripheral vision, maintaining the same distance behind her. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Auburn Avenue was a main thoroughfare through the Fourth Ward. Many people walked its sidewalks even after dark. But as she made the final turn toward her boarding house, the footsteps behind her continued to match her pace. When she walked faster, they quickened. When she slowed to look in a shop window, they hesitated as well. The night air seemed to grow heavier as Emma hurried through the narrow residential streets. The gas lamps here were spaced farther apart, creating pools of yellow light separated by stretches of deep shadow. Between the lampposts, the darkness felt alive, pressing close with a weight that made her skin prickle. 3 blocks from home, Emma made a decision that would later haunt the investigation. Instead of continuing straight on Auburn Avenue to the well-lit front entrance of her boarding house, she turned left into a narrow alley that would cut 2 blocks off her journey. It was a shortcut she'd used dozens of times during daylight hours, a simple passage between 2 rows of tenements that emerged onto the street just 50 yards from Mrs. Henley's front door. The alley was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. Brick walls rose on both sides, punctuated by narrow windows and back doors that led to cramped apartments, where entire families made their homes in 2 or 3 rooms. During the day, children played in the dusty passage while their mothers hung laundry from lines stretched between the buildings. At night, it became a different place entirely. A tunnel of shadow where footsteps echoed off the brick walls and every doorway might conceal a watching presence. Emma's footsteps rang sharp against the cobblestones as she hurried through the passage. Behind her, the other footsteps continued their steady rhythm, neither gaining ground nor falling back. The sound bounced off the narrow walls, creating an echo that made it impossible to determine exactly how far behind her follower might be. Halfway through the alley, the gas lamp that normally provided illumination began to flicker. Emma had noticed it guttering the previous evening and assumed the city workers would repair it during the day, but as she approached, the flame danced weakly, casting uncertain light that made the shadows shift and writhe against the brick walls. She was directly beneath the lamp when it finally died, plunging the alley into complete darkness. Emma stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, the footsteps had ceased as well. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city, a train whistle from the rail yards, the faint music from a saloon several streets away, the soft murmur of voices from an open window above. In that moment of darkness and stillness, Emma felt the weight of her solitude. She was alone in a narrow alley with a stranger who had followed her for nearly a mile. The boarding house was only a few dozen yards away, but those yards might as well have been miles. Her mouth went dry and she could taste the metallic flavour of fear. She began to move again, placing each foot carefully on the uneven cobblestones. The darkness was so complete that she had to trail one hand along the brick wall to maintain her direction. The mortar between the bricks felt rough under her fingertips, still warm from the day's heat. The footsteps behind her resumed as well, but something had changed in their character. They were softer now, more careful, as if her follower was also feeling his way through the darkness. But they were closer too, close enough that she could hear the soft scrape of leather against stone with each step. Emma's breathing became shallow, rapid. She tried to move faster, but the darkness made speed dangerous. Twice she stumbled over loose cobblestones, catching herself against the wall with scraped palms. Each stumble seemed to echo through the alley, announcing her fear to anyone who might be listening. Behind her, the footsteps maintained their measured pace, never hurrying, never faltering, always present. The end of the alley appeared as a faint grey rectangle against the black walls, the opening onto Auburn Street where gas lamps cast their reliable yellow glow. Emma focused on that distant light, like a swimmer focuses on shore, counting each step that brought her closer to safety. 20 steps. 15. 10. At 5 steps from the street she heard a different sound behind her, a soft intake of breath, as if someone was preparing to speak or to call out. Emma didn't turn to look. Instead, she broke into a run, her heeled boots clattering against the cobblestones as she burst from the alley onto the lamplit street. The boarding house stood across Auburn Avenue, its familiar 3 stories rising like a sanctuary in the night. Light glowed in several windows and Emma could see the reassuring bulk of Mrs. Henley moving about in the front parlour. She ran across the street without looking for traffic, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Only when she reached the front steps did she turn to look back at the alley. The opening gaped like a mouth in the row of buildings, darkness so complete it seemed solid. For a long moment she stared into that blackness, waiting to see if anyone would emerge. But the alley remained empty, silent, giving up no secrets. Emma climbed the steps to the front door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her key. Behind her, Auburn Avenue stretched away in both directions, peaceful and ordinary under the gas lamps. A few pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, a couple arm in arm, returning from an evening's entertainment. A solitary man reading a newspaper beneath a lamp, 2 women in deep conversation outside a millinery shop. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. But Emma's skin still crawled with the sensation of being watched. She let herself into the boarding house and climbed the narrow stairs to her room on the 2nd floor. The familiar creaks of the old building, the murmur of voices from other rooms, the smell of Mrs. Henley's evening cooking, all of it felt like a protective embrace after the terror of the alley. In her room, Emma lit the oil lamp on her washstand and drew the curtains across her window. Only then did she allow herself to consider what had happened. Had someone actually been following her? Or had her imagination transformed innocent coincidence into menace? The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. The footsteps could have belonged to anyone. The darkness had made everything seem sinister. By the time she prepared for bed, Emma had almost convinced herself that fear had made her foolish. Tomorrow she would laugh at her timidity, at the way shadows and imagination had conspired to frighten her. She said her prayers, blew out the lamp, and settled beneath her quilted coverlet. Sleep came eventually, but it brought dreams of narrow alleys and following footsteps, of gas lamps that flickered and died at precisely the wrong moment, of shadows that moved with purposeful intent through the darkness of the Fourth Ward. Emmylou Sharp would never know that her instincts that night had been perfectly correct. Someone had indeed been following her. Someone who had studied her routines and chosen her with careful deliberation. Someone who had watched her enter the boarding house and noted which window belonged to her room. Someone who was, at that very moment, standing in the shadows across Auburn Avenue, looking up at her darkened window and planning his next move. The Atlanta Ripper had found his first victim. But that encounter in the alley was only the beginning. The real horror would begin 3 nights later, when Emmylou Sharp failed to return from her evening shift at the mill. By then, the pattern would be established, the nightmare would have begun, and Atlanta would start to understand that something evil had come to prowl its gaslit streets. The city slept on, unaware that autumn would bring terror to its doorsteps. In the grand homes of Peachtree Street and the modest cottages of Grant Park, in the tenements of the Fourth Ward and the mill villages beyond the city limits, Atlanta's citizens rested peacefully in their beds, trusting in gas lamps and police patrols to keep the darkness at bay. They did not yet know that darkness could take human form, could walk among them wearing the face of respectability, could strike without warning and vanish without trace. They did not know that their city had become hunting grounds for a predator, unlike any they had faced before. The clock in the downtown courthouse tower chimed midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping city. In her narrow room on Auburn Avenue, Emmylou Sharp stirred in her sleep, caught in dreams of shadow and pursuit. 3 streets away, a figure in a dark coat stood watching her boarding house, patient as stone, deadly as winter. The Atlanta Ripper was ready to begin his work in earnest. Chapter 2. The Milltown's Shadow. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over Atlanta's Fourth Ward on September 23, 1911, casting weak light through the perpetual haze of cotton dust and coal smoke that hung like a shroud over the tenement districts. The brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder along the narrow streets, their windows dark with grime, their doorsteps worn smooth by the passage of countless mill workers trudging to and from their daily labours. Mrs. Hattie Caldwell discovered Emmylou Sharp's body at 6:30 that morning when she stepped outside her boarding house to collect the milk bottles left by the dairy wagon. The sight that greeted her in the narrow alley behind the building would haunt her remaining days. Emma lay crumpled against the brick wall like a discarded doll, her dark hair fanned across the cobblestones, her face turned toward the lightening sky with an expression of terrible surprise frozen upon her features. The constables arrived within the hour, their heavy boots echoing against the close walls of the alley as they examined the scene. Detective Samuel Thornton, a weathered man with steel-grey whiskers who had served the Atlanta Police Department for nearly 2 decades, knelt beside the body with practiced solemnity. His examination revealed wounds that spoke of careful deliberation rather than frenzied attack. The killer had worked with surgical precision, leaving no mark upon the victim's clothing save for the dark stains that had soaked into the fabric of her simple cotton dress. Emmylou Sharp had been 23 years old, a mill girl who worked the night shift at the Exposition Cotton Mills on Boulevard Street. She lived alone in a cramped room on the 3rd floor of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, sending most of her wages to her ailing mother in the hill country near Dahlonega. Her fellow boarders described her as quiet and industrious. the sort of young woman who attended Methodist services on Sundays and rarely ventured out after dark except when her work required it. The previous evening had been different. Emma had finished her shift at the cotton mill at 11 o'clock, as she did every night, but instead of taking her usual route directly home along Boulevard Street, she had walked to the trolley stop on Edgewood Avenue. Several witnesses had seen her there, standing beneath the electric lamp that illuminated the waiting platform, checking her pocket watch repeatedly as if expecting someone who never arrived. Mrs. Josephine Morris, who operated a small dry goods store near the trolley stop, had noticed Emma's unusual behaviour through her shop window. The young woman had seemed agitated, pacing back and forth on the platform, glancing frequently toward the shadows that gathered beyond the reach of the electric light. After nearly an hour of waiting, Emma had finally begun her walk home, taking the longer route through the maze of alleys that connected the commercial district to the Fourth Ward's residential streets. Detective Thornton questioned the residents of the boarding houses and tenements that lined Emma's final path. Most had been asleep by the time she passed through the neighbourhood, but old Mr. Ezra Patterson, who suffered from insomnia and often sat by his second-floor window during the restless hours before dawn, had heard footsteps in the alley below sometime after midnight. 2 sets of footsteps, he insisted, walking in careful synchronization until they suddenly stopped. The pattern of Emma's wounds suggested a killer who possessed both anatomical knowledge and considerable skill with a blade. The cuts were deep and precise, placed with surgical accuracy to ensure swift death, while minimizing the victim's ability to cry out for help. Detective Thornton had seen similar wounds during his service in the Spanish-American War, when field surgeons worked by lamplight to save or end suffering with equal efficiency. News of Emma's death spread through the Fourth Ward like smoke through the tenement halls. The mill workers gathered in small groups on street corners and in boarding house parlours, their voices hushed as they discussed the tragedy that had befallen one of their own. The women began walking in pairs after dark, clutching their shawls close and casting nervous glances toward the shadows that pooled in doorways and alley mouths. The Atlanta Constitution devoted 3 column inches to Emma's murder on page 4 of the morning edition, describing her as a respectable mill girl who met with foul play while returning from her employment. The brief article made no mention of the peculiar precision of her wounds, or the deliberate manner in which her body had been arranged against the brick wall, positioned as if she were merely sleeping in the pale light of dawn. Within the Fourth Ward itself, however, the details of Emma's death took on a different significance. Mrs. Caldwell whispered to her remaining boarders that the killer had left no footprints in the dust beside the body, as if he had vanished like morning mist. Old Patterson swore that he had seen a tall figure in dark clothing standing motionless at the mouth of the alley for several minutes after the footsteps stopped, though he could make out no features in the gloom. The mill workers began to recall other incidents that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now carried ominous weight. Sarah Jenkins, who worked the same shift as Emma at the exposition mills, remembered seeing a well-dressed stranger loitering near the factory gates several evenings before the murder. The man had worn a dark overcoat despite the warm September weather, and had watched the workers with unusual intensity as they emerged from the building at the end of their shifts. Detective Thornton interviewed Sarah at her boarding house on Auburn Avenue, a narrow 3-story building that housed nearly 40 mill workers in conditions that barely met the standards of human habitation. Sarah described the stranger as tall and lean, with pale hands that remained perfectly still at his sides as he observed the departing workers. His face had been shadowed by the brim of a dark hat, but she had noticed his eyes, which seemed to catalogue each person who passed before him with the methodical attention of a clerk recording inventory. The detective's investigation revealed that Emma had been acting strangely in the weeks before her death. Her supervisor at the mill reported that she had been requesting different shifts, trying to avoid the night work that had been her regular assignment for over a year. She had also been seen in conversation with unfamiliar men on several occasions, though her fellow workers could provide no clear descriptions of these encounters. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned that Emma had received an unusual number of letters in the month before her death, delivered by a private messenger rather than through the regular postal service. The landlady had thought little of it at the time, assuming that Emma's correspondence with her mother had increased due to the older woman's declining health. However, when Detective Thornton asked to examine the letters, Mrs. Caldwell discovered that Emma's room had been thoroughly searched sometime between her death and the detective's visit. The letters, along with Emma's personal diary and any other written materials, had vanished without trace. The search of Emma's room revealed other peculiarities that deepened the mystery surrounding her death. Her small savings, nearly $30 hidden beneath a loose floorboard, remained untouched. Her few pieces of jewellery, modest though they were, still lay in their accustomed places on her dresser, yet someone had methodically examined every drawer, every hiding place, every possible location where personal papers might have been concealed. Detective Thornton began to suspect that Emma's murder had been planned well in advance, executed by someone who had studied her habits with patient thoroughness. The killer had known her schedule, her usual route home, even the specific alley where she might be cornered without witnesses. This was not the work of a common criminal seeking money or momentary gratification, but rather the calculated action of someone with a deeper and more sinister purpose. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate neighbourhood, as Detective Thornton sought to understand Emma's connections to the wider city. He learned that she had occasionally attended evening lectures at the Young Women's Christian Association, where mill girls and shop workers could learn basic reading and arithmetic skills that their circumstances had denied them in childhood. The instructors remembered Emma as an eager student, who asked thoughtful questions about history and literature, subjects that seemed to fascinate her despite her limited formal education. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a volunteer instructor at the YWCA, recalled that Emma had shown particular interest in stories about medieval Europe, especially accounts of the great cathedrals and the lives of saints and scholars who had devoted themselves to learning and contemplation. Emma had once confided that she dreamed of saving enough money to attend a proper school, perhaps even to travel beyond Georgia and see the places she had read about in the association's small library. These aspirations seemed tragically distant from the reality of Emma's life in the Fourth Ward, where the air itself carried the taste of cotton dust, and the constant rumble of machinery marked the passage of days and nights. Yet Detective Thornton began to wonder if Emma's intellectual curiosity had somehow connected her to the refined stranger who'd been observed watching the mill workers with such calculating attention. The detective's inquiries gradually revealed a network of relationships that extended beyond the narrow world of the tenements and factories. Emma had apparently been corresponding with someone who possessed considerable education and refinement, someone who had encouraged her scholarly interests and perhaps offered assistance in pursuing her dreams of advancement. The missing letters suggested that these communications had contained information that someone was desperate to conceal. As September faded into October, Detective Thornton found himself pursuing leads that seemed to dissolve like smoke whenever he drew close to substantial evidence. Witnesses remembered seeing Emma with an unidentified companion, but their descriptions varied so dramatically that they might have been describing different people entirely. The mysterious letters had vanished so completely that even the messenger who had delivered them seemed to have disappeared from the city altogether. The Fourth Ward settled into an uneasy vigilance as autumn deepened and the days grew shorter. The mill workers continued their daily routines, but the shadow of Emma's death hung over the neighbourhood like the perpetual haze of industrial smoke. Women walked in groups after dark, and boarding house keepers began locking their doors at earlier hours. The comfortable anonymity of the great city had been broken, revealing the vulnerability that lay beneath its bustling prosperity. Detective Thornton sensed that Emma Lou Sharp's murder represented something larger and more dangerous than a single act of violence. The precision of the killing, the careful removal of evidence, and the methodical search of the victim's possessions all suggested a mind capable of long-term planning and execution. As the investigation continued into the lengthening nights of October, the detective began to fear that Emma's death might be merely the first movement in a symphony of carefully orchestrated horror that was only beginning to unfold in the shadows of Atlanta's industrial districts. Chapter 3. The Physician's Discovery. The morning mist clung to Peachtree Street like shrouds draped over the sleeping city, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke and magnolia blossoms that had become Atlanta's signature perfume. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stepped from his carriage onto the cobblestones outside the city morgue, his leather medical bag weighing heavier than usual in his gloved hand. The September sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows between the brick buildings that housed Atlanta's growing industrial heart. At 53 years of age, Dr. Whitfield had witnessed more death than most men twice his years. The war between the states had introduced him to mortality in its most brutal forms when he was barely 22, fresh from medical college and unprepared for the carnage that would define his generation. Later, yellow fever epidemics had swept through the reconstructed city like biblical plagues, filling makeshift hospitals with the dying and the desperate. Yet nothing in his decades of practice had prepared him for what awaited him in the basement chambers beneath the municipal building. The morgue keeper, a thin man named Josiah Crane, whose pallor seemed permanently stained by his profession, met Dr. Whitfield at the heavy oak door that separated the living world from its grim counterpart. Crane's hands trembled slightly as he worked the brass key in the lock, and his normally steady voice carried an unfamiliar tremor when he spoke of the body that had arrived during the night watches. Emma Lou Sharp lay upon the marble examination table like a broken doll discarded by some cruel child. Her cotton dress, once a cheerful shade of blue that matched her eyes, had been torn and stained with substances that Dr. Whitfield preferred not to contemplate in the gentle morning light. Her auburn hair, which neighbours would later remember as her finest feature, lay matted against the cold stone, and her hands, those small, capable hands that had sewn buttonholes at the textile factory for 12 hours each day, were frozen in positions that spoke of her final, futile struggle. Dr. Whitfield had examined Emma's body with the methodical precision that had served him through decades of medical practice, but even his trained eyes struggled to comprehend the deliberate cruelty that had been visited upon this young woman. The wounds were not random acts of violence born from passion or desperation. They followed patterns, almost surgical in their placement, suggesting a knowledge of human anatomy that disturbed the physician more than the violence itself. The first cut had been made with what appeared to be a blade of considerable sharpness, possibly a surgical instrument or a well-maintained straight razor. It began just below Emma's left ear and traced a precise line across her throat, severing the carotid artery with the efficiency of a trained butcher. But this primary wound, which would have proven fatal within minutes, was merely the beginning of the killer's terrible work. Additional incisions marked Emma's torso, each one deliberate and purposeful, arranged in what Dr. Whitfield could only describe as a grotesque approximation of medical procedure. The killer had taken considerable time with his victim, working with the patience of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Most disturbing of all, the physician noted, the wound suggested that Emma had remained conscious through the early stages of the attack, her body bearing evidence of the restraints that had held her still while her tormentor pursued his methodical work. Dr. Whitfield's examination revealed another troubling detail that would haunt him for weeks to come. Beneath Emma's fingernails, he discovered fragments of what appeared to be expensive fabric, silk, perhaps, or fine wool of the sort worn by Atlanta's growing merchant class. The fibers were dark blue or black, suggesting formal attire of the kind favoured by professionals or successful businessmen. This physical evidence painted a picture of Emma's killer that contradicted the prevailing assumptions about criminal behaviour in the city's rougher districts. The physician's report, written in his careful script with a steel-nibbed pen, would eventually find its way to the desk of Detective Inspector Harold Morrison, whose own investigation into Atlanta's recent troubles had begun to reveal disturbing patterns. But on that September morning, as Dr. Whitfield cleaned his instruments, and prepared to release Emma's body to her grieving family. He could not have known that her murder represented merely the second note in a symphony of horror that would terrorize Atlanta for months to come. 3 days later, the physician found himself summoned to examine a second victim, this one discovered in the basement of a boarding house near the railway depot. Mary Catherine Sullivan, aged 26, had worked as a seamstress in one of the city's numerous garment factories, earning barely enough wages to maintain her cramped room and send occasional coins to her widowed mother in rural Georgia. Like Emma, Mary had been walking alone through Atlanta's narrow streets when she encountered her killer, though the circumstances of her capture remained shrouded in mystery. The parallels between the two murders were impossible to ignore, even for a mind trained in scientific skepticism like Dr. Whitfield's. Mary's wounds followed the same precise patterns that had marked Emma's body, and once again, the physician discovered evidence of expensive fabric beneath the victim's fingernails. The killer's methods had evolved slightly. He had used chloroform to render Mary unconscious before beginning his work, suggesting either medical knowledge or access to a hospital or pharmacy where such substances could be obtained. Dr. Whitfield's growing unease extended beyond the purely medical aspects of these examinations. Both victims had been young women of respectable character, employed in legitimate occupations and known in their neighbourhoods as industrious and moral individuals. Neither had been associated with the gambling halls or houses of ill repute that dotted Atlanta's seedier districts, nor had they been known to keep company with men of questionable reputation. They were, in every sense, representative of the hard-working class that formed the backbone of Atlanta's remarkable recovery from the devastation of war and Reconstruction. The physician began to maintain detailed notes of his observations, documenting not only the medical evidence but also his growing theories about the nature of the killer they faced. His experience with human anatomy suggested that their unknown adversary possessed considerable knowledge of surgical technique, possibly indicating formal medical training or extensive experience with butchery or taxidermy. The precision of the cuts and the systematic nature of the violence pointed to a mind capable of planning and patience, characteristics that distinguish these crimes from the typical acts of passion or desperation that usually brought bodies to his examination table. More troubling still was the killer's apparent ability to move freely through Atlanta's streets without arousing suspicion. Both victims had been taken from areas with moderate foot traffic, suggesting that their captor could approach young women without immediately triggering alarm. This implied either a respectable appearance that would not frighten potential victims, or a practiced ability to present a non-threatening demeanour until the moment of attack. Dr. Whitfield's medical training had taught him to approach problems with methodical observation and logical deduction, but the case of Atlanta's unknown killer challenged even his disciplined mind. The evidence suggested a predator of unusual sophistication, someone who combined the ruthlessness of a wild animal with the calculated intelligence of a trained professional. Such individuals were rare in any population, but in a city like Atlanta, still rebuilding its identity in the aftermath of war, and expanding rapidly with the influx of workers drawn by industrial opportunities, they could move with terrifying anonymity. As autumn deepened and the cotton mills released their workers into the gathering darkness earlier each evening, Dr. Whitfield found himself studying the faces of his fellow citizens with new attention. The killer walked among them, attended the same churches, perhaps conducted business with the same merchants, or drank coffee in the same establishments. He might be a successful professional, given the evidence of expensive clothing and medical knowledge. He could be married, respected in his community, trusted by neighbours who would find it impossible to believe that such horrors could emerge from someone they considered a gentleman. The physician's observations would prove prophetic in ways that even his analytical mind could not foresee. As September gave way to October, and the sweet olive trees released their fragrant blooms into the cooling air, Atlanta's killer would continue his terrible work, growing bolder with each success and more refined in his methods. The city's narrow streets and gaslit alleys would become hunting grounds where terror walked in the guise of respectability, and where death came dressed in the finest clothes that money could buy. Dr. Whitfield completed his reports and filed them with the municipal authorities, but he harboured little hope that conventional investigation would quickly identify their quarry. The killer's intelligence and apparent social standing would provide natural camouflage in a city eager to forget its violent past and embrace its prosperous future. The physician could only document the evidence and pray that Atlanta's growing nightmare would end before more innocent lives were claimed by the shadow that moved through their midst with such deadly purpose. The gaslight flickered against the morgue windows as Dr. Whitfield locked his medical bag and prepared to return to the world of the living, carrying with him the terrible knowledge that somewhere in Atlanta's respectable neighbourhoods, a monster was perfecting his craft. Chapter 4. The Web of Fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Decatur Street, as news of Emma Lou Sharp's death spread through Atlanta's Fourth Ward like wildfire through dry cotton. By the time the church bells tolled 8 o'clock, clusters of women had gathered in doorways and along the narrow sidewalks, their voices hushed but urgent, their eyes darting toward every unfamiliar face that passed. The comfortable rhythms of daily life, the clatter of milk wagons, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children heading to school, all seemed muted beneath the weight of a terrible new reality. Detective William Morrison stood at the mouth of the alley where Emma's body had been discovered just before dawn, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the scene. The gaslight that had failed the night before cast weak illumination over the cobblestones, revealing little more than shadows and the faint outline of chalk marks where the body had lain. Morrison had seen his share of violence in his 23 years with the Atlanta Police Department, but something about this killing unsettled him in ways he could not quite articulate. Perhaps it was the methodical nature of the wounds, or the strange positioning of the victim, or simply the fact that Emma Lou Sharp was the third young woman to die in such circumstances within the span of 2 months. The detective pulled his pocket watch from his vest and noted the time with mechanical precision. 8:15 in the morning on September 23rd, 1911. The air still held the humid weight of summer, though autumn had begun to whisper its approach in the cooler evenings and the subtle shift in the quality of light. Atlanta was a city caught between seasons, between centuries, between the old ways of the antebellum South and the industrial promise of a new age. The cotton mills that lined the Chattahoochee River worked day and night, their smokestacks painting grey streaks across the sky, their whistles marking the hours with mechanical certainty. Morrison walked slowly down the alley, his boots echoing against the brick walls that rose on either side like canyon walls. These narrow passages between the tenement buildings had become veins of shadow in the growing city, places where gaslight struggled to penetrate and where the sounds of the street seemed distant and muffled. Emma Lou Sharp had walked this same path countless times, returning home from her work at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, her footsteps as familiar to these stones as the rain that washed them clean each week. The mill girls, as they were known throughout the city, formed a particular class of working women in Atlanta's rapidly changing social landscape. They rose before dawn to begin their shifts at 6 o'clock, standing for 12 hours beside the great looms that wove cotton into cloth, their hands moving with practiced precision despite the deafening roar of machinery. The work was hard and the pay modest, but it offered something precious to young women like Emma: independence, however fragile, and the possibility of a future shaped by their own choices rather than the whims of fathers or husbands. Emma Lou had been 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper and eyes the colour of winter sky. She had come to Atlanta from a small farm outside Macon 3 years earlier, drawn like so many others by the promise of steady work and the excitement of city life. Her letters home, discovered among her few possessions in the cramped boarding house room she shared with another mill girl, painted pictures of a young woman cautiously optimistic about her prospects, saving her wages penny by penny towards some undefined but cherished dream. The boarding house on Ivy Street where Emma had lived stood 4 stories tall, its red brick facade darkened by years of coal smoke and industrial grime. Mrs. Adelaide Whitman, the proprietress, maintained strict rules for her female tenants. No visitors after 9 o'clock, no alcohol on the premises, church attendance required on Sundays, and rent due every Saturday without fail. The arrangement provided safety and respectability for young women far from their families, but it also created a closed world where rumours spread quickly and fear could take root like kudzu in the Georgia heat. In the days following Emma's death, that fear began to manifest in subtle but unmistakable ways. The other mill girls walked in groups when darkness fell, their voices bright with forced cheer but their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Mrs. Whitman instituted new rules. All tenants must return by 9:30. The front door would be locked and barred at 10 o'clock sharp, and any unusual sounds or suspicious persons must be reported immediately. The gaslight in front of the boarding house burned continuously now, its yellow glow creating a small island of illumination in the gathering darkness of autumn evenings. Detective Morrison's investigation had revealed troubling patterns that connected Emma's death to 2 previous murders. Sarah Catherine Mills, aged 19, had been found dead in an alley near the Exposition Cotton Mills on July 28th. Margaret Rose Thompson, 24 years old, had been discovered behind the Atlanta cotton factory on August 15th. All 3 victims had been mill workers, all had been walking alone at night, and all had died from wounds inflicted by what the police surgeon described as a narrow, sharp blade wielded with surgical precision. The killer moved through the city like smoke through chimneys, leaving no witnesses and few clues. The police had questioned hundreds of people, mill supervisors, boarding house keepers, shopkeepers who stayed open late, night watchmen who patrolled the industrial districts. They had mapped the locations of the murders, studied the timing of the attacks, and followed every lead that emerged from the frightened whispers of the Fourth Ward. Yet the Atlanta Ripper, as the newspapers had begun to call him, remained as elusive as morning mist rising from the Chattahoochee River. The investigation had been complicated by the social attitudes of the time. Mill girls occupied an uncomfortable position in Atlanta's class structure. Too independent to be considered proper ladies, too respectable to be dismissed as fallen women. Some members of polite society whispered that young women who walked the streets alone after dark were inviting trouble. That tragedy was the inevitable consequence of abandoning traditional roles and protections. Others argued that these hard-working girls deserved the same security and consideration afforded to any citizen of Atlanta. Captain James R. English, head of the Atlanta Police Department's Detective Division, had assigned his most experienced investigators to the case. Morrison worked alongside Detective Thomas Calloway, a younger man whose sharp mind and methodical approach complemented Morrison's intuitive understanding of criminal behaviour. Together, they had begun to construct a profile of their quarry based on the evidence left behind and the testimony of those who lived and worked in the affected neighbourhoods. The killer appeared to be familiar with the industrial districts of Atlanta, moving through the maze of alleys and side streets with the confidence of someone who knew the terrain intimately. He struck always between the hours of 10 and midnight, when the streets had emptied but before the night shift workers began their trek to the mills. His weapon of choice suggested either medical training or experience in butchering, and his ability to approach victims without raising alarm indicated a non-threatening appearance and demeanour. Most disturbing of all was the methodical nature of the attacks. Each victim had been killed quickly and efficiently, with wounds that suggested the killer took no pleasure in prolonged suffering, but rather sought to accomplish his purpose with cold precision. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of robbery, no indication of the kind of frenzied violence that marked crimes of passion or desperation. The Atlanta Ripper killed with the mechanical efficiency of a machine, and that calculated coldness chilled the blood of even the most experienced investigators. As September drew to a close, the city settled into an uneasy rhythm of heightened vigilance and nervous routine. The mill whistles continued to mark the hours, the trolley cars ran their regular routes, and the great engines of commerce and industry maintained their steady operation. But beneath the surface normalcy, Atlanta held its breath, waiting for the next shadow to move in the gaslight, the next set of footsteps to echo in the narrow alleys where 3 young women had already walked their last walk home. The newspapers carried daily reports on the investigation, their headlines growing more sensational with each passing day. The Atlanta Constitution spoke of a reign of terror in the Fourth Ward, while the Atlanta Journal warned of the fiend who stalks our streets. Editorial writers demanded action from the police, from the mayor, from anyone with the power to restore safety to the city's working neighborhoods. Citizens organized patrols and purchased pistols, while mothers forbade their daughters to venture out after dark. In the boarding houses and tenements where the mill girls made their homes, evening conversations inevitably turned to the murders. The young women shared theories and suspicions, warnings and reassurances, creating an informal network of protection that stretched throughout the industrial districts. They watched out for one another with fierce loyalty, walking in groups, checking in regularly, and maintaining a constant awareness of potential danger that was both necessary for survival and exhausting to sustain. Mrs. Whitman had taken to sitting by the front window of her establishment each evening, her keen eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. She had lived in Atlanta for 47 years, had seen the city grow from a small railroad town to a major industrial center, and had witnessed her share of violence and tragedy. But the systematic hunting of young women in her neighborhood represented something new and particularly sinister. A predator who viewed the mill girls not as individuals with hopes and dreams and families who loved them, but as prey to be stalked and killed with mechanical precision. The fear was not confined to the Fourth Ward. Throughout Atlanta, parents kept their daughters closer to home, employers worried about their female workers, and the entire social fabric of the city began to show the strain of living under siege. The Atlanta Ripper had succeeded in terrorizing a population of nearly 200,000 people, proving that a single determined killer could hold an entire city hostage through the simple expedient of random, methodical violence. As Detective Morrison continued his investigation into the cool October days that followed Emma Lou Sharp's death, he found himself thinking often about the nature of evil and the thin line that separated civilization from chaos. The killer moved among them like a cancer in the body politic, invisible until the damage was done, impossible to predict or prevent. And somewhere in the maze of Atlanta's streets and alleys, he was already selecting his next victim, already planning his next methodical strike in the darkness that gathered with each shortening day. Chapter 5. The pattern emerges. The autumn of 1911 settled over Atlanta like a shroud, bringing with it a creeping awareness that something had shifted in the city's fabric. Detective Thomas Calloway stood in the gaslit precinct office on Decatur Street, studying the collection of evidence that had accumulated across his desk like fallen leaves. 3 women dead in as many months, each discovered in the narrow alleyways that threaded through Atlanta's working neighborhoods like dark veins. The electric bulbs that had recently been installed in the station house cast harsh shadows across the photographs and reports, creating an almost theatrical quality to the grim tableau. Outside, the city continued its relentless march toward modernity, with automobile horns mingling with horse-drawn carriages and the distant whistle of the Western and Atlantic Railroad carrying its nightly cargo toward the Tennessee mountains. Calloway had been with the Atlanta Police Department for nearly 15 years, long enough to witness the city's transformation from a war-scarred southern town into a bustling industrial centre. He had seen his share of violence in the Fourth Ward and Buttermilk Bottom, where poverty and desperation created their own particular brand of brutality. But these killings possessed a different quality altogether, a methodical precision that spoke of something far more disturbing than the usual crimes of passion or desperation. The first victim, Sarah Whitmore, had been discovered on a Tuesday morning in late July behind Morrison's dry goods store on Auburn Avenue. The shopkeeper who found her body initially thought she had simply collapsed from the oppressive summer heat, that had been plaguing the city for weeks. It was only when he approached closer that he noticed the thin red line across her throat, so precise it might have been drawn with a ruler. Sarah had been 23 years old, recently arrived from the cotton farms of South Georgia to seek employment in one of the city's textile mills. She rented a small room in a boarding house on Ivy Street, keeping to herself and sending most of her wages back to her elderly parents in Cordele. The other boarders described her as quiet and devout, attending services at the Baptist Church on Edgewood Avenue every Sunday morning without fail. The second victim, Margaret O'Brien, was found 6 weeks later in the alley behind Klein's department store on Peachtree Street. Margaret had been working as a seamstress in a small shop that catered to the wives of Atlanta's growing merchant class, specialising in the elaborate mourning attire that Victorian sensibilities still demanded even as the new century progressed. She was discovered by a delivery boy making his early morning rounds, her body arranged with the same careful attention to detail that had marked Sarah's murder. Margaret's background painted a similar portrait of respectability and isolation. She had emigrated from County Cork 7 years earlier, following the promise of work in America's growing textile industry. She lived alone in a modest apartment above a bakery on Lucky Street, spending her evenings reading by lamplight and writing letters to relatives back in Ireland who would never receive them. The third victim, Emma Lou Sharp, had been found just 2 weeks prior in the shadowed recesses of the alley behind the Kimball House Hotel. Emma worked as a laundress for several of the city's more prosperous families, trudging each day between the grand homes on Peachtree and West End, with bundles of fine linens and delicate undergarments that required the careful attention only hand washing could provide. Each woman had been killed in the same methodical manner, their throats cut with surgical precision, using what the city's coroner believed to be an extremely sharp blade, possibly a straight razor or surgical instrument. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest they had been given any opportunity to fight for their lives. Most disturbing of all, each body had been arranged in an identical pose, hands folded across the chest, eyes closed, as if the killer took particular care to ensure his victims appeared peaceful in death. Calloway had spent countless hours walking the routes each woman would have taken on their final evenings, timing the distances between gaslight posts and noting the locations where shadows pulled deepest. Atlanta's ambitious street lighting program, championed by Mayor Robert Maddox as a symbol of the city's progressive spirit, created islands of illumination connected by stretches of profound darkness where anything might happen unseen. The detective had also begun mapping the killer's apparent hunting ground, using coloured pins on a large map of the city that hung on his office wall. A distinct pattern was emerging, centred around the commercial districts where Atlanta's working women earned their modest livings, but extending into the residential neighbourhoods where they sought shelter each night. The gaslight districts held a particular fascination for Calloway, as he considered the killer's methodology. These newer installations had been celebrated in the Atlanta Constitution as evidence of the city's march towards civilization, pushing back the primitive darkness that had long characterized southern cities after sunset. Yet it seemed their killer was using this very infrastructure to his advantage, timing his movements to coincide with the predictable rhythms of the lighting schedule. Each evening at precisely 11 o'clock, the city's gasworks would reduce pressure to the street lamps, creating a noticeable dimming that lasted until the early morning hours. This nightly ritual had become so routine that most residents adjusted their evening activities accordingly, hurrying to complete their business before the streets grew dim. The killer appeared to understand this schedule intimately, striking during the vulnerable hours when working women were making their way home through neighborhoods that offered little protection. The social dynamics of Atlanta in 1911 created additional layers of vulnerability that Calloway found deeply troubling. The city's rapid industrial growth had drawn thousands of young women from rural Georgia and neighboring states, all seeking the promise of steady wages and independence that the textile mills and commercial establishments offered. These women often lived alone or in small groups, far from the protective networks of family and community that had sheltered previous generations. Many worked late shifts at the mills or in service positions that required them to travel through the city after dark. The social expectations of the era demanded they maintain strict standards of respectability while navigating an urban environment that offered little protection for those without means or connections. They existed in a precarious middle ground, neither wealthy enough to afford the security of carriages and escorts, nor poor enough to be entirely invisible to potential predators. The boarding houses and modest apartments where Atlanta's working women lived created another element of the killer's apparent strategy. Unlike the grand homes of Inman Park or West End, these dwellings offered little in the way of security or supervision. Landladies were often absent or overwhelmed, and the transient nature of the population meant that disappearances might go unnoticed for days or weeks. Calloway had interviewed dozens of women in similar circumstances, and their accounts painted a disturbing picture of vulnerability. Many reported being followed or approached by strangers, particularly in the evening hours when they travelled between work and home. Some had received anonymous letters or small gifts left at their boarding houses, tokens of unwanted attention that they had dismissed as harmless until news of the murders began spreading through the city's working neighbourhoods. The detective's investigation had also revealed the extent to which the killer appeared to study his victims before striking. Each woman had been observed in the days preceding her death, with boarding house neighbours and co-workers recalling strangers who seemed to take particular interest in their routines and schedules. The killer appeared to be selecting victims based on specific criteria, though the exact nature of his preferences remained frustratingly unclear. All three women had been of similar age and appearance, between 20 and 30 years old, with dark hair and modest dress that marked them as members of Atlanta's respectable working class. All lived alone or in situations that offered minimal protection. All followed predictable routes between work and home that took them through areas where the killer could observe their movements without drawing attention. The autumn weather had begun to affect the investigation in ways that Calloway found increasingly troubling. The shorter days meant that more of the city's business was conducted in darkness, while the cooling temperatures encouraged people to walk more quickly and pay less attention to their surroundings. The killer seemed to be adapting his methods to these changing conditions, becoming bolder and more confident with each successful attack. Recent reports from patrol officers suggested that the killer might be escalating his activities. Several women had reported being approached or followed by a man matching a vague description that had emerged from witness accounts, a figure described as well-dressed but unremarkable, someone who could blend easily into the crowds that filled Atlanta's commercial districts during business hours. The investigation had been complicated by the social attitudes of the era toward both working women and violent crime. Many of Atlanta's more established citizens viewed the murders as unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable consequences of women living without proper supervision or protection. This perspective had limited both public cooperation with the investigation and pressure on city officials to devote adequate resources to solving the crimes. Calloway recognized that he was hunting a predator who understood not only the physical geography of Atlanta, but its social landscape as well. The killer moved through the city with confidence born of knowledge, selecting victims who occupied vulnerable positions in society and striking in locations where discovery would be delayed and investigation hindered. As October deepened into November, the detective found himself walking the same streets his quarry travelled, trying to see the city through the killer's eyes. He studied the rhythm of shift changes at the mills, the schedules of the trolley lines, the patterns of foot traffic that created opportunities for surveillance and attack. He began to understand that he was not simply hunting a murderer, but someone who had made killing into a carefully planned enterprise. The gaslight continued to flicker in the narrow alleyways of Atlanta's working neighbourhoods, casting its uncertain illumination across the stage where this deadly drama continued to unfold, while somewhere in the shadows, a killer prepared for his next performance in the terrible theatre he had created from the city's darkest spaces. Chapter 6. The Fourth Ward: Shadows. The morning sun cast long shadows through the narrow windows of the Atlanta Police Department as Detective William Harper spread the case files across his weathered oak desk. The autumn of 1911 had brought with it a peculiar darkness to the city, one that seemed to seep through the very foundations of the Fourth Ward like groundwater through cracked stone. 3 women now lay in the city morgue, their lives cut short by hands that moved with surgical precision through the gaslit streets of Georgia's capital. Harper's fingers traced the edges of the photographs, each one a testament to the methodical nature of the killer who had begun to haunt Atlanta's working districts. Emma Lou Sharp, aged 23, had been found at dawn in Butler Street's narrow alley, her body positioned with the same careful arrangement that had marked the previous victims. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Westbrook, had delivered his report with the measured tones of a man who had witnessed too much death in his 40 years of service to the city. The detective's office occupied the second floor of the brick building on Decatur Street, its walls lined with wanted posters and maps of the city's expanding districts. Through the window, Harper could observe the steady flow of morning commerce as merchants arranged their wares along the sidewalks, and factory workers made their way toward the textile mills that had transformed Atlanta into the beating heart of the New South. The city had grown rapidly since the war's end, drawing people from the surrounding counties who sought employment in the cotton mills and railroad yards that defined the modern landscape. Inspector Thomas Mitchell entered the office carrying a leather satchel filled with witness statements and evidence collected from the latest crime scene. His face bore the drawn expression of a man who had spent the early hours walking through darkness, searching for clues that might illuminate the mind behind these calculated murders. Mitchell had served with the Atlanta force for 15 years, having begun his career during the tumultuous period of Reconstruction when the city struggled to rebuild itself from the ashes of Sherman's march. The 2 men worked in contemplative silence as they arranged the evidence according to the established patterns they had begun to recognize. Each victim had been a working woman, employed in the textile factories or domestic service positions that provided livelihood for the city's growing population of young migrants. Each had been found in the early morning hours, discovered by factory workers or delivery men beginning their daily routines. The killer seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of the Fourth Ward's geography, selecting locations that offered both privacy and easy escape routes through the maze of alleys and side streets that connected the residential districts. Harper opened the file containing Emma Lou Sharp's personal effects, cataloguing each item with the methodical attention that had earned him recognition as one of Atlanta's most capable investigators. A small leather purse containing 47 cents and a trolley ticket stub, a silver locket bearing the photograph of an elderly woman, presumably her mother, a handwritten letter from someone named Joseph expressing hopes for a Christmas reunion. These fragments of interrupted life spoke of dreams and connections that would never reach fulfillment. The detective had grown familiar with such remnants during his years of service. Each case brought him into contact with the intimate details of lives cut short, the small possessions and personal correspondence that revealed the humanity behind the headlines that filled Atlanta's newspapers. The Constitution had begun running daily updates about the murders, their coverage growing more sensational with each passing week as public concern mounted throughout the city's neighborhoods. Dr. Westbrook arrived at the police station shortly after 9 o'clock, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave with the weight of his findings. The coroner had examined each victim with the thoroughness that his profession demanded, documenting injuries and collecting evidence that might provide insight into the killer's methods and motivations. His reports revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested someone with considerable knowledge of human anatomy, someone who understood precisely how to inflict maximum damage with minimal struggle. The 3 men gathered around Harper's desk as Westbrook presented his latest observations. The killer employed a sharp instrument, likely a knife with a blade measuring between 4 and 5 inches in length. The wounds demonstrated a level of precision that indicated either medical training or extensive experience with such implements. Most significantly, each victim had been approached from behind, suggesting that the killer possessed the ability to move silently through the night streets without attracting attention. Outside the police station, Atlanta continued its daily transformation from a sleepy southern town into a modern industrial city. The streetcar lines that had been installed during the past decade carried workers and shoppers throughout the expanding metropolitan area, connecting the residential districts with the commercial centres that anchored the city's economic growth. The Fourth Ward itself had become a melting pot of recent arrivals, rural families seeking opportunities in the textile mills that promised steady employment and the possibility of improved circumstances. Mitchell shared the information he had gathered during his morning interviews with residents of Butler Street and the surrounding blocks. Several witnesses reported seeing a well-dressed man walking through the neighbourhood during the late evening hours, though their descriptions varied considerably regarding his height, age, and general appearance. The darkness of the gaslit streets made positive identification nearly impossible, and the killer seemed to possess an uncanny ability to avoid the main thoroughfares where electric lighting had begun to replace the older gas fixtures. The inspector's notebook contained detailed sketches of the crime scene, documenting the precise location where Emma Lou Sharp's body had been discovered, and noting the position of nearby buildings, doorways, and potential escape routes. His methodical approach to evidence collection reflected the new scientific methods that were beginning to influence police work throughout the country, techniques that emphasize careful observation and systematic analysis rather than relying solely on witness testimony and confession. Harper studied the map of Atlanta that covered the wall behind his desk, marking the location of each murder with red pins that formed a rough triangle encompassing several blocks of the Fourth Ward. The killer's selection of sites demonstrated familiarity with the neighbourhood's layout, knowledge that suggested either residence in the area or frequent visits for business or personal reasons. The detective had begun compiling a list of local residents whose occupations or circumstances might provide them with the anatomical knowledge displayed in the murders. The autumn weather had grown increasingly unpredictable, with warm afternoons giving way to sudden temperature drops that left the evening air sharp and clear. These conditions seemed to favour the killer's activities, providing the cover of darkness while encouraging potential victims to hurry through their evening travels rather than lingering in public spaces where they might find safety in numbers. The changing seasons also brought with them the psychological effects that Harper had observed during his years of investigative work, the way that shorter days and longer nights seemed to influence human behaviour in subtle but significant ways. Dr. Westbrook described the killer's apparent ritual behaviour, the careful arrangement of the victims' bodies and personal effects that suggested symbolic meaning or psychological compulsion. Each woman had been positioned in a similar manner, facing eastward toward the rising sun, with her hands folded across her chest in a gesture reminiscent of burial preparation. These details indicated that the murders were not random acts of violence, but rather components of a larger pattern that reflected the killer's internal motivations and beliefs. The coroner's analysis extended beyond the physical evidence to encompass the psychological profile that was beginning to emerge from the accumulated data. The killer appeared to be an organized individual who planned his attacks carefully, selecting victims according to specific criteria and executing his crimes with methodical precision. The absence of sexual assault suggested motivations other than physical gratification, perhaps rooted in religious or ideological convictions that transformed murder into a form of ritualized behavior. Mitchell reported that several Fourth Ward residents had begun altering their evening routines, choosing to remain indoors after dark or travelling only in groups when circumstances required them to venture outside. The neighbourhood's atmosphere had changed noticeably since the murders began, with people speaking in hushed tones about the danger that seemed to lurk in every shadow. Local churches had organised prayer meetings and neighbourhood watch groups, community responses that reflected both spiritual seeking and practical concern for public safety. The detective examined the timeline of events surrounding each murder, searching for patterns that might reveal the killer's schedule or preferred conditions for his crimes. Emmylou Sharp had died on a Wednesday evening following murders that had occurred on Monday and Friday of previous weeks. The spacing suggested either random opportunity or a deliberate schedule that accommodated other responsibilities or commitments in the killer's life. Harper's investigation had expanded to include interviews with employers at the textile mills where each victim had worked, seeking information about any common connections or shared experiences that might explain their selection as targets. The mill supervisors spoke of hard-working young women who had come to Atlanta seeking independence and economic security, rural migrants who had left family farms to pursue opportunities in the rapidly industrializing city. The autumn afternoon shadows lengthened across the detective's office as the three men continued their analysis of the evidence. Outside, the sounds of Atlanta's daily commerce began to diminish as merchants closed their shops and factory workers completed their shifts. Soon, the Fourth Ward would settle into the uneasy quiet that had characterized its evening since the murders began, residents hurrying through their necessary travels while casting anxious glances toward every darkened doorway and narrow alley. Dr. Westbrook gathered his papers and prepared to return to the morgue where Emmylou Sharp's body awaited final preparation for burial. The coroner's work represented one small component of the larger investigation that was beginning to consume the resources and attention of Atlanta's police force. Each piece of evidence, every witness statement and physical clue contributed to the gradually emerging picture of a killer who moved through the city's shadows with deadly purpose and methodical precision. As evening approached, Harper remained at his desk, studying the accumulated files and contemplating the challenge that lay ahead. Somewhere in Atlanta's maze of streets and neighborhoods, a predator continued his calculated hunt, selecting victims according to criteria known only to himself, and executing murders that reflected both careful planning and ritualized behavior. The detective understood that time worked against his investigation, that each passing day brought the possibility of another death, and the growing likelihood that fear would begin to paralyze the very communities he had sworn to protect. The gaslight outside the police station flickered to life as darkness settled over the city, casting its familiar glow across the streets, where another night would soon test the resolve of both hunter and hunted in the shadows of Atlanta's Fourth Ward. Chapter 7. The pattern emerges. The autumn of 1911 brought with it a peculiar restlessness to Atlanta's streets, as if the very air had grown thick with unspoken fears. The gaslight districts that had once hummed with the comfortable rhythms of working-class life now carried an undertone of vigilance, a subtle shift in the way shadows were regarded and footsteps measured. Detective Captain William Morrison stood at his office window in the old City Hall building, watching the lamplighters begin their evening rounds along Peachtree Street, and felt the weight of 3 unsolved murders pressing against his shoulders like stones. The Emmylou Sharp case had joined the growing collection of files that haunted his desk drawer. Each manila folder contained the careful documentation of lives cut short in darkness, women who had vanished from the gaslit streets only to be discovered in the grey hours before dawn. The pattern that had begun to emerge from these tragic remnants painted a picture that chilled even Morrison's weathered sensibilities, a methodical precision that spoke of calculation rather than passion. The city's newspapers had begun to whisper of connections between the deaths, though the police department maintained its official stance of treating each case individually. The Atlanta Constitution ran careful articles that danced around the growing fears without naming them directly, while the Atlanta Georgian took a more sensational approach, their headlines growing bolder with each passing week. The Evening Journal maintained its reputation for measured reporting, but even their seasoned crime correspondent Marcus Whitfield had begun to note similarities that could not be easily dismissed. Morrison drew the case files from his locked drawer and spread them across the mahogany surface of his desk. The photographs were arranged with clinical precision, each victim's final portrait a testament to the methodical nature of their killer. Emmylou Sharp, aged 23, a seamstress who lived in a boarding house near the cotton mills. Margaret O'Brien, 25, who worked the night shift at the telephone exchange and walked home through the Fourth Ward each morning before sunrise. Sarah Catherine Bell, 19, a domestic servant who'd been returning from her half-day off when she encountered her fate in the narrow streets behind Auburn Avenue. The similarities extended beyond their circumstances. Each woman had been found within a quarter-mile radius of the others, their bodies discovered in the early morning hours by workers heading to the mills or delivery boys beginning their rounds. The physical evidence suggested a killer who worked with surgical precision, someone who understood anatomy with the knowledge of a medical professional, or perhaps a butcher accustomed to working with sharp instruments. The wounds were clean, efficient, designed to silence rather than torture. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the city's coroner, had spent countless hours examining the evidence with the meticulous care that had earned him respect throughout the medical community. His preliminary reports, written in the careful script of a man trained in both medicine and law, painted a picture of methodical violence that suggested their killer possessed both knowledge and nerve. The attacks occurred in darkness, always in locations where the victim would be isolated from potential witnesses, always executed with a speed that spoke of careful planning. The timing of the attacks revealed another disturbing pattern. Each murder had occurred on a Thursday evening, between the hours of 11 and 1 in the morning, when the streets were at their emptiest and the gaslights cast their longest shadows. This regularity suggested a killer who operated according to some internal schedule, someone whose movements were dictated by routine, or perhaps by the demands of legitimate employment that provided both cover and opportunity. Morrison had assigned his most experienced detectives to canvass the neighbourhoods where the victims had lived and worked. Detective Sergeant Thomas Kellerman, a 20-year veteran of the force who had worked through the city's roughest periods, led the investigation into Emma Lou Sharp's final days. His methodical interviews with her fellow seamstresses at the Exposition Cotton Mills revealed a young woman who had been increasingly nervous in the weeks before her death, mentioning to her roommate that she felt as though someone had been following her home from work. The telephone exchange where Margaret O'Brien had worked provided another crucial piece of the emerging puzzle. The night supervisor, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, recalled that Margaret had requested to change her shift pattern in the weeks before her death, expressing concerns about walking home alone in the early morning hours. Her request had been denied due to staffing needs, a decision that now weighed heavily on Mrs. Thornton's conscience as she provided her statement to Detective Kellerman. Sarah Catherine Bell's case presented the most complex web of circumstances. As a domestic servant in one of the grand homes on Peachtree Street, she moved between two different worlds, the refined atmosphere of her employer's household during the day and the working-class neighbourhoods where she lived during her limited free time. Her employer, Mrs. Harrison Caldwell, described Sarah as a reliable and conscientious worker who had never given cause for concern. The other servants in the household painted a picture of a young woman who was careful with her money and devoted to her family back in rural Georgia, sending most of her wages home to help support her younger siblings. The investigation into Sarah's movements on her final evening revealed that she had spent her half-day off visiting the Grand Opera House, where a travelling company was performing scenes from Shakespeare. The theatre manager, Mr. Frederick Ashworth, remembered her purchasing a ticket for the late afternoon performance, noting her careful examination of the programme and her obvious excitement at attending such a cultural event. She had sat alone in the gallery section reserved for working-class patrons, her modest dress and careful attention to the performance marking her as someone who regarded the theatre as a special treat rather than routine entertainment. After the performance, Sarah had walked south along Peachtree Street toward the boarding house district, where she rented a small room on the third floor of Mrs. Abigail Weston's establishment. The route would have taken her past the business district, through the residential neighbourhoods where the city's middle class had built their modest but comfortable homes, and finally into the area where single working women could find affordable lodging within walking distance of their employment. Mrs. Weston provided a detailed account of Sarah's usual routines and habits. The young woman typically returned from her half-day outings before 9 o'clock in the evening, always stopping at the landlady's office to collect any mail and to confirm her rent payment for the coming week. On the evening of her death, Sarah had failed to appear for this customary check-in, a deviation from routine that Mrs. Weston found troubling enough to mention to other residents. The physical evidence from all 3 crime scenes suggested a killer who came prepared for his work. The weapon used appeared to be a surgical knife or similar instrument, wielded by someone with enough anatomical knowledge to achieve maximum efficiency with minimal struggle. Dr. Hartwell's examinations revealed that each victim had been approached from behind, the attack occurring so quickly that there were no defensive wounds on their hands or arms. The precision of the cuts suggested someone who had performed similar actions before, either in a medical capacity or through previous criminal acts. Detective Morrison had requested assistance from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, whose experience with similar cases in other cities might provide valuable insights into the investigation. The agency's Atlanta office, managed by Captain James McDonough, had agreed to review the case files and provide consultation on investigative techniques that had proven effective in other jurisdictions. McDonough's preliminary assessment confirmed Morrison's growing suspicions that Atlanta was dealing with a killer who would continue his work until caught or prevented by circumstances beyond his control. The social dynamics of the city added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Atlanta in 1911 was a community still finding its identity in the aftermath of Reconstruction, a place where old traditions competed with new industrial realities. The victims represented a particular demographic, young working women who lived independently and moved through the city streets with a confidence that came from steady employment and economic self-sufficiency. Their vulnerability lay not in poverty or desperation, but in their very independence, which required them to navigate the urban landscape alone during hours when protection was scarce. The city's response to the mounting crisis reflected these social tensions. The more established neighborhoods organized informal patrols of male residents who volunteered to escort working women to and from their destinations during evening hours. The churches opened their doors for special prayer services, where congregations gathered to seek divine protection for their community and to organize practical assistance for vulnerable residents. The women's suffrage organizations, though still controversial in conservative Georgia, found their membership swelling as women sought collective action in response to individual helplessness. Mayor James Woodward had authorized additional police patrols in the affected neighborhoods, but the limited resources of the municipal force meant that coverage remained spotty and unpredictable. The gas company had been requested to maintain better lighting along the most dangerous routes, though the aging infrastructure and limited budget made comprehensive improvements unlikely in the near term. The streetcar company had extended service hours on certain lines to reduce the distance that working women needed to walk alone after dark. As November approached, Detective Morrison found himself studying maps of the city with increasing fascination and growing dread. The 3 murder sites formed a rough triangle within the 4th Ward, each location carefully chosen for its isolation and limited visibility from surrounding buildings. The killer's knowledge of the neighborhood suggested either long-term residence in the area or systematic surveillance that had identified the most vulnerable locations for his purposes. The investigation had produced no witnesses to the actual crimes, but several residents had reported seeing a figure moving through the streets during the relevant time periods. The descriptions varied in detail but shared certain common elements. A man of average height and build, dressed in the type of dark clothing favoured by working-class men, moving with purpose but without haste through the gaslit streets. The lack of distinctive features in these accounts suggested someone who had mastered the art of appearing ordinary, of blending into the urban landscape without attracting attention or remaining in memory. The autumn nights grew longer and colder as October surrendered to November, bringing with it a sense of expectation that hung over the city like morning fog over the Chattahoochee River. The pattern that had emerged from 3 deaths suggested that a 4th was inevitable, that somewhere in Atlanta's working-class neighborhoods, another young woman was moving unknowingly toward an appointment with darkness that would end only with the sunrise, and another addition to Detective Morrison's growing collection of unsolved cases. Chapter 8: the web tightens. The morning of October 3rd brought with it a peculiar stillness to Atlanta, the kind that settles over a city when something fundamental has shifted in the darkness. The cotton mills continued their rhythmic clatter. The streetcars maintained their schedules along Peachtree and Marietta, and the merchants opened their shops as they had for decades past. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the neighborhoods like water through cracked stone. Detective Walter Hensley stood in the pale dawn light outside the boarding house on Ivy Street, watching as the coroner's men carried away what remained of Emma Lou Sharp. The 23-year-old seamstress had been discovered in her room just after midnight by Mrs. Catherine Bellwether, the proprietress, who had grown concerned when Emma failed to answer repeated knocks at her door. The scene that greeted them when they finally forced the lock would haunt the boarding house for years to come. The room itself told a story of careful preparation and methodical execution. Emma's few possessions had been arranged with deliberate precision along the windowsill. Her prayer book, a small daguerreotype of her deceased parents, a thimble worn smooth by years of careful stitching. Her work dress hung neatly in the wardrobe, and her Sunday shoes were positioned exactly parallel beneath the narrow bed. It was as if someone had taken great care to honour her memory, while simultaneously destroying her future. The physical evidence spoke to the same calculated mind that had visited terror upon Martha Hendricks and Sarah Catherine Mills in the weeks prior. The window latch had been manipulated from the outside, though the mechanism showed no signs of crude forcing. Instead, the brass fitting appeared to have been coaxed open by someone intimately familiar with such hardware, suggesting either considerable skill or previous reconnaissance of the building's vulnerabilities. A thin layer of brick dust on the exterior sill indicated repeated contact with the wall, as though the perpetrator had practiced this particular approach multiple times before committing to action. Inside the room, the killer's signature restraint was evident in every detail. Emma had been positioned with the same careful attention to dignity that had marked the previous murders, her arms folded across her chest and her eyes closed as though in peaceful sleep. A single white lily, already beginning to wilt in the October heat, had been placed in her folded hands, a gesture that spoke to some twisted sense of reverence, or perhaps mockery of traditional funeral practices. Dr. James Morrison, the city's chief medical examiner, emerged from the boarding house shortly after 7 o'clock, his weathered face grave with the weight of his findings. The preliminary examination had revealed injuries consistent with the previous victims, though he noted subtle variations that suggested the killer's methods were evolving with each encounter. The precision of the wounds indicated not just anatomical knowledge, but a growing confidence in technique that made Morrison's hands tremble slightly as he recorded his observations. Word of Emma's death spread through the Fourth Ward like smoke through autumn leaves, carried by washerwomen gathering at the public wells and shopkeepers opening their establishments to another day of uncertain commerce. The neighbourhood's working-class residents, already strained by the industrial demands of cotton processing and textile manufacturing, found themselves facing a new kind of pressure, the weight of fear that made every shadow suspicious and every stranger a potential threat. Mrs. Bellwether, a widow who had operated her boarding house for nearly 15 years, sat in her kitchen parlour as the morning progressed, her hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee that had long since grown cold. The establishment had served as home to dozens of young women over the years, seamstresses and mill workers and shop clerks who found in her modest rooms a temporary refuge from the hardships of earning their keep in an unforgiving city. Now she wondered if her well-intentioned hospitality had inadvertently provided a hunting ground for someone whose appetites ran toward the unthinkable. The investigation into Emma's death revealed patterns that both illuminated and obscured the killer's identity. Like the previous victims, she had maintained regular habits that would have made her movements predictable to anyone willing to observe and record them. Each Tuesday evening she attended the Methodist prayer meeting on Auburn Avenue. Thursdays found her at the public market purchasing the simple provisions that sustained her through the week. Saturdays were reserved for visiting her elderly aunt who lived in a tenement near the railroad yards, carrying with her small tokens of affection purchased with her carefully hoarded wages. This predictability, Detective Hensley realized, created opportunities for surveillance that the killer appeared to have exploited with methodical patience. Witnesses recalled seeing a figure in dark clothing lingering near the corners where Emma typically passed, always maintaining sufficient distance to avoid scrutiny while keeping her movements in clear view. The descriptions varied in their specifics. Some remembered a tall man in a bowler hat, others a shorter figure in a long coat, but all shared certain characteristics that suggested deliberate attempts at disguise rather than natural variation in observation. The killer's knowledge of Atlanta's architectural peculiarities became increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. The boarding house on Ivy Street, like many structures in the rapidly growing city, had been constructed during the post-war rebuilding period, when speed often took precedence over security. Windows designed for ventilation in Georgia's humid climate frequently featured simple latching mechanisms that could be manipulated by anyone with patience and the proper tools. The killer demonstrated familiarity not just with these general vulnerabilities, but with the specific characteristics of each building targeted. Police Captain Robert Sterling expanded his patrols throughout the affected neighborhoods, assigning additional officers to the evening shifts when the killer appeared to prefer operating. These men, drawn from the ranks of Atlanta's modest police force, found themselves walking beats that had transformed from routine municipal duty into something approaching military reconnaissance. They carried with them not just the standard equipment of law enforcement, but an awareness that they were hunting someone whose intelligence and preparation exceeded anything in their previous experience. The social fabric of the Fourth Ward began showing signs of strain as October progressed. Young women who had previously walked home alone from their evening employment now travelled in groups, their conversations punctuated by nervous glances toward doorways and alleys that had once seemed merely urban landscape. Boarding house proprietors instituted new security measures, requiring tenants to check in at specified hours and accounting for any deviations from established routines. The textile mills, where many of the neighborhood's residents found employment, became informal centers of information exchange as workers shared rumors, observations, and theories about the killer's identity. Some suspected a disgruntled former employee of one of the factories, someone whose intimate knowledge of the workers' schedules would facilitate the careful surveillance that preceded each attack. Others pointed toward the transient population that moved through Atlanta's railroad yards, suggesting that the killer might be exploiting the city's position as a transportation hub to enter and exit the area undetected. Dr. Morrison's detailed examination of Emma's remains provided additional insights into the killer's psychological profile. The careful positioning of the body, the placement of the funeral lily, and the meticulous arrangement of personal belongings all suggested someone who viewed the murders not as random acts of violence, but as ritualistic ceremonies requiring specific protocols and procedures. This ritualistic aspect, Morrison noted in his confidential report to Detective Hensley, indicated a mind that had constructed elaborate justifications for its actions, justifications that might provide investigative opportunities if properly understood. The medical evidence also revealed troubling signs of escalation in the killer's behavior. While maintaining the same basic methodology that had characterized the previous murders, the injuries inflicted upon Emma showed subtle increases in both severity and duration. The killer appeared to be spending more time with each victim, either before or after death, conducting activities that left no obvious physical evidence, but suggested a growing comfort with extended exposure to risk. Local newspapers, operating under voluntary restraint agreements negotiated with city officials, published carefully worded accounts that informed the public while avoiding sensational details that might inspire copycat crimes or compromise the investigation. The Atlanta Constitution's coverage focused on safety recommendations and community cooperation, while the Atlanta Georgian provided updates on the police investigation's progress without revealing specific methodological details that might assist the killer in evading capture. The religious community responded to the crisis with increased evening services and organised prayer vigils, transforming the churches into gathering places where residents could find both spiritual comfort and practical safety in numbers. Reverend Thomas Mackenzie of the First Baptist Church organised escort services for parishioners returning home from evening activities, while the Methodist congregations coordinated their schedules to ensure continuous presence in the neighbourhoods during the hours when the killer appeared most active. As October's second week began, Detective Hensley found himself reviewing evidence that painted an increasingly complex picture of their quarry. The killer demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities, intimate knowledge of Atlanta's geography and architecture, and access to information about potential victims' personal routines. Yet for all this preparation and intelligence, the murders themselves retained an element of spontaneity that suggested the killer was responding to opportunities rather than following a rigid, predetermined schedule. The investigation's progress was measured not in dramatic revelations, but in the gradual accumulation of seemingly minor details that might eventually coalesce into actionable intelligence. Witness statements were cross-referenced with delivery schedules and work patterns. Building blueprints were examined for common vulnerabilities. Weather records were consulted to determine whether atmospheric conditions influenced the killer's decision-making processes. Through it all, the city continued its daily rhythms with a determined normalcy of a community refusing to surrender its identity to fear. Cotton continued flowing through the mills, streetcars maintained their schedules, and the merchants conducted their business with the resilient pragmatism that had rebuilt Atlanta from the ashes of war. Yet beneath this surface continuity, everyone understood that something fundamental had changed in their city's character, something that would require resolution before true peace could return to their neighbourhoods. The evening of October 10th brought with it the first genuinely cool air of the season, a reminder that even Georgia's mild autumn eventually yielded to winter's approach. As darkness settled over the Fourth Ward, residents secured their windows and checked their locks with the ritualistic thoroughness of people who had learned not to take safety for granted. In his modest office above the police station, Detective Hensley reviewed the case files one more time, searching for patterns that might have escaped previous scrutiny. Somewhere in the accumulating evidence lay the key to understanding not just what the killer had done, but who he was and where he might strike next. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The autumn of 1911 descended upon Atlanta like a shroud drawn slowly across a deathbed. The cotton mills along the Chattahoochee River worked their looms through the lengthening nights, their mechanical heartbeat thrumming against the darkness while gas lamps flickered in windows of boarding houses and tenements. In the Fourth Ward, where narrow streets wound between brick buildings like arteries through diseased flesh, the working folk went about their evening rituals with increasing unease. 3 months had passed since Emmylou Sharp had vanished from Ivy Street, leaving behind only a torn piece of her shawl caught on a wrought iron fence, and questions that multiplied like shadows at dusk. The Atlanta Constitution had relegated her disappearance to the back pages, sandwiched between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of church socials. Yet in the neighbourhoods where gaslight barely held the darkness at bay, her name was whispered with the reverence reserved for the recently dead. Detective William Morrison had grown thin during those months, his face taking on the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who saw too much and understood too little. His small office in the Atlanta Police Department headquarters had become a monument to frustration, its walls papered with photographs of crime scenes, maps of the city marked with red pins, and newspaper clippings that told the same story in different words. The pattern was there, clear as scripture to those who knew how to read it, yet the killer remained as elusive as morning mist. The investigation had consumed Morrison's days and haunted his nights. He walked the same streets where the victims had walked, questioned the same witnesses who had nothing new to tell, and studied the same evidence that yielded no fresh secrets. His notebook filled with observations that seemed significant in the gaslight, but crumbled to dust in the morning sun. The killer moved through Atlanta like a ghost, leaving death in his wake but no trail that mortal men could follow. In the boarding houses of Sweet Auburn, where coloured folk gathered on porches to share news and gossip, the name of Ruth Williams was spoken in hushed tones. She had worked as a seamstress in a shop on Auburn Avenue, her nimble fingers crafting dresses for the wives of prosperous merchants. Her landlady, Mrs. Beulah Jackson, had found her room empty one morning in late August, the bed unslept in and her sewing basket overturned on the floor. The police had asked their questions and filled out their forms, but the investigation had moved with the sluggish pace of molasses in winter. Ruth's disappearance had sent ripples of fear through the coloured community, where protection came not from badges and uniforms, but from vigilant neighbours and locked doors. The women who worked in the white folks' houses began travelling in groups, their conversations punctuated by nervous glances over shoulders. Children were called inside before the street lamps were lit, and the sound of footsteps on cobblestones after dark brought curtains twitching aside at windows. Mrs. Jackson had taken to sleeping with a carving knife beneath her pillow, its steel blade cold against her fingers when nightmares woke her in the small hours. She had known Ruth Williams since the girl was barely 16, fresh from a farm outside Macon, with dreams of city life burning bright in her dark eyes. The seamstress had possessed a quiet dignity that made her popular with customers, her soft voice and careful manners earning tips that other girls envied. Now her room stood empty, a shrine to vanished hopes and unanswered prayers. The pattern that Detective Morrison saw in his sleepless vigils extended beyond the boundaries of race and class that divided Atlanta society. Mary Catherine Sullivan had disappeared from an Irish boarding house near the railroad yards in early September, leaving behind a rosary and a letter half written to her sister in Savannah. The proprietor, a thick-set woman named Mrs. O'Brien, had discovered the absence when Mary failed to appear for her shift at the textile mill. The girl's few possessions remained undisturbed, her small trunk still locked and her Sunday dress hanging pressed and ready in the wardrobe. Mary Catherine had arrived in Atlanta just 6 months earlier, one of thousands of young women drawn to the city by promises of steady work and independence. She sent half her wages home to Ireland each month, carefully folding the bills into envelopes addressed in her precise Catholic school handwriting. Her fellow boarders remembered her as devout and hard-working, rising before dawn to attend Mass at the cathedral before beginning her 12-hour shift at the mill. She had no followers among the young men, no enemies among her peers, no reason to vanish into the night like smoke from a snuffed candle. The newspapers had begun to notice the pattern by October, though they approached the subject with the delicate language of a more genteel age. The Atlanta Constitution ran a series of articles about the need for young women to exercise caution when walking alone after dark, while the Atlanta Georgian published interviews with ministers who spoke of moral decay and the dangers of city life. Nor the publication mentioned the growing conviction among police investigators that something far more sinister than moral decay was stalking the streets of Atlanta. Detective Morrison's investigation had taken him into corners of the city where gaslight barely penetrated the gloom. He had questioned dock workers along the Chattahoochee, mill supervisors who knew the routines of their female employees, saloon keepers who served whiskey to men with hungry eyes and empty consciences. Each interview added another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every revelation. Like a photograph developing in a dark room to reveal not clarity but deeper shadows. The city's medical examiner, Dr. Holbrook, had become Morrison's reluctant ally in the search for answers. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that smelled perpetually of carbolic acid, he approached his work with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher. His examination of the crime scenes where evidence had been found revealed details that the newspapers never printed. Observations that painted a picture of calculated violence performed by someone who understood anatomy with disturbing intimacy. Dr. Holbrook's reports, written in his careful script on official city letterhead, documented wounds that spoke of surgical knowledge and anatomical study. The killer possessed skills that suggested medical training or experience in the butchering trades, yet he applied them with a precision that seemed to serve no practical purpose beyond the infliction of terror. The doctor had begun to suspect that they were dealing with someone who killed not for profit or passion, but for the dark satisfaction that came from exercising absolute power over another human being. The investigation had also drawn the attention of Atlanta's emerging criminal element, men who operated gambling halls and houses of ill repute in the shadows between respectability and lawlessness. These entrepreneurs of vice possessed their own networks of information, gathered in smoky back rooms where whiskey loosened tongues and money purchased silence. Detective Morrison had learned to navigate this twilight world, trading information and favours with men whose names never appeared in church registers or social directories. One such figure was Gentleman Jim Coker, who ran a high-stakes poker game in the basement of a defunct textile warehouse. Coker cultivated the appearance of respectability, wearing tailored suits and speaking in the cultured tones of a man who had once moved in better circles. His establishment catered to mill supervisors, railroad foremen, and ambitious merchants who sought excitement unavailable in their daylight pursuits. It was there that Morrison first heard whispers of a patron who had begun appearing at irregular intervals, always well-dressed and soft-spoken, who seemed to take particular interest in conversations about the missing women. The stranger never stayed long enough to establish lasting relationships, arriving alone and departing the same way. Other patrons remembered him as unremarkable in appearance, the sort of man who could disappear into a crowd without leaving an impression. He spoke little during the card games, but his questions showed an unsettling fascination with the details of the disappearances. Coker had noticed that the man's hands were unusually clean for someone who claimed to work in the cotton trade, with fingernails that showed the careful attention of someone accustomed to handling delicate instruments. As October surrendered to November, the mood in Atlanta's working-class neighborhoods grew increasingly tense. Women who had once walked confidently through familiar streets now hurried between pools of gaslight, their eyes darting toward every shadow and doorway. The city's nightlife began to change as establishments that had once remained open until the small hours closed their doors earlier, unwilling to risk the safety of their female employees. Even the houses of prostitution, those sanctuaries of carefully managed sin, instituted new rules about clients and working hours. Detective Morrison found himself walking the same routes that the vanished women had travelled, trying to see the city through their eyes on those final nights. He studied the placement of street lamps, noting which alleys remained in perpetual shadow and which boarding houses offered clear views of the surrounding streets. The killer's selection of victims seemed random at first glance, but deeper examination revealed a pattern of opportunity and isolation that suggested careful surveillance and patient planning. The detective's notebooks filled with observations about the rhythm of city life, the ebb and flow of workers between shifts, the lonely hours when honest folks slept and other creatures stirred in the darkness. He began to understand that the killer possessed an intimate knowledge of Atlanta's hidden geography, those spaces between the mapped and documented where violence could occur without immediate discovery. This was someone who had studied the city like a scholar studies ancient texts, learning its secrets and weaknesses with academic thoroughness. The investigation had also revealed the limitations of law enforcement in an age when communication moved no faster than horses and trains. Neighbouring counties operated as separate kingdoms, sharing information reluctantly and pursuing their own investigations without coordination. Detective Morrison had begun corresponding with police departments in Charleston, Savannah, and Birmingham, searching for patterns that might extend beyond Atlanta's boundaries. The responses came slowly, carried by postal workers who traversed the same roads where other predators might hunt. As the first frost touched Atlanta's streets, bringing with it the promise of winter's approach, Detective Morrison prepared for what he increasingly believed would be a long campaign against an enemy who understood the advantages of patience and preparation. The killer had demonstrated remarkable discipline in his methods, leaving behind just enough evidence to confirm his existence while maintaining the anonymity that allowed him to continue his work. The coming months would test the resolve of both hunter and hunted, as the dance between law and lawlessness played out against the backdrop of a city struggling to maintain its innocence in an age of growing darkness. The gaslight continued to flicker in the windows of boarding houses and tenements, casting its uncertain glow across streets where ordinary people pursued their daily routines, while something far from ordinary moved among them, patient as winter and twice as cold. Chapter 10. The Silence of Stone. The courthouse clock struck midnight as Detective William Morrison closed the final file on the Atlanta Ripper case. The leather-bound folder, thick with witness statements and crime scene photographs, settled onto his desk with the weight of unfinished business. Outside his window, the gaslit streets of downtown Atlanta stretched into darkness, holding their secrets close like a miser clutches gold. 7 months had passed since Emma Lou Sharp's body was discovered in that narrow alley off Decatur Street, her throat open to the September night. 7 months of false leads, desperate theories, and the gradual erosion of hope. The killer had vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of terror that still haunted the city's working neighborhoods. Morrison leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking in protest. His hair had grown grey at the temples during those autumn and winter months of pursuit, and lines had etched themselves around his eyes like tributaries of exhaustion. The case had consumed him with the slow persistence of fever, driving him through countless nights of investigation that yielded nothing but shadows and speculation. The newspapers had eventually moved on to other horrors. The Constitution and the Journal found fresh scandals to fill their columns, and the Atlanta Ripper faded from the front pages to the inside sections, then to brief mentions, then to nothing at all. The city's memory, Morrison had learned, was mercifully short when it came to unsolved terrors, but the detective remembered everything. Each crime scene was burned into his consciousness like acid on copper plate. Mary Elizabeth Crawford, found beside the railroad tracks with her hands folded across her chest as if prepared for burial. Sarah Collins, discovered in Piedmont Park, beneath a canopy of oak leaves that had turned the colour of dried blood. Helen Morrison, no relation. Though the shared name had haunted his dreams, lying in her boarding house room with the window open to let in the October cold. 5 women in total, 5 lives cut short by hands that moved with surgical precision through the darkness of Atlanta's nights. The killer had chosen his victims with careful deliberation, selecting women who walked alone after sunset, who lived in the margins of respectability where their disappearance might go unnoticed for crucial hours or days. Morrison had studied the patterns until they blurred before his eyes. The killer struck only during the new moon, when the streets lay wrapped in velvet darkness. He chose locations near the railroad lines where the sound of freight trains could mask any cries for help. He left no evidence save the wounds themselves, clean cuts that spoke of anatomical knowledge and steady hands. Dr. Harold Whitman, the city coroner, had provided what insight he could during those long winter consultations in the basement morgue. The physician was a careful man who chose his words with the precision of his scalpel, and he had grown increasingly troubled as the pattern emerged. The killer possessed medical training, Whitman was certain. The incisions were too precise, too purposeful to be the work of an amateur. Someone with knowledge of human anatomy was walking Atlanta's streets, using his education for purposes that defied comprehension. The investigation had led Morrison through every corner of the city's medical community. He had interviewed physicians at Grady Hospital, questioned the faculty at Atlanta Medical College, and spent countless hours reviewing the records of every surgeon, medical student, and hospital orderly who might have possessed the requisite skill. Each inquiry led to another dead end. Another respectable citizen with an unshakable alibi and a reputation beyond reproach. The killer's knowledge extended beyond mere anatomy. He understood the rhythms of the city, the patterns of police patrol, the blind spots where darkness gathered thick enough to hide unspeakable acts. He knew which alleys provided escape routes and which boarding houses contained women who lived alone, unprotected by family or fortune. As winter deepened into 1912, Morrison had begun to suspect that the killer was not merely educated but connected to the city's establishment in ways that made detection nearly impossible. Perhaps he was a physician whose patients vouched for his whereabouts during the crucial hours. Perhaps he was a professor whose academic reputation provided perfect camouflage. The most dangerous predators, Morrison had learned, were often those who wore the masks of respectability with the greatest conviction. The detective's pursuit had taken him into Atlanta's twilight world of boarding houses and factory neighborhoods, where working women scraped together enough coin to rent cramped rooms and walked home alone through streets that offered little protection. He had interviewed dozens of these women, warning them of the danger that stalked their community, watching fear bloom in their eyes like flowers in a poisoned garden. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, who ran a boarding house on Auburn Avenue, had spoken for them all during one late November conversation that Morrison would never forget. She was a widow who had taken in young women who worked the cotton mills and department stores, providing them with clean rooms and motherly supervision. The murders had aged her visibly, carving worry lines around her eyes and mouth. "They're afraid to walk alone after dark," she had told Morrison, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I see them huddled together at the trolley stops, waiting in groups until they can escort each other home. Some have moved back to their families in the countryside, preferring poverty to this terror. The ones who remain barely sleep. They barricade their doors and listen for footsteps in the hallway. The fear had spread beyond the killer's intended victims. Atlanta's entire population had contracted into themselves like creatures preparing for winter hibernation. Hardware stores reported increased sales of locks and bolts. The police had added extra patrols to the affected neighborhoods, but their presence provided only the illusion of safety. Everyone understood that a killer clever enough to evade capture for months would not be deterred by uniformed officers walking predictable beats. Morrison had worked through the Christmas season, forsaking holiday celebrations to pursue leads that inevitably dissolved like snow in spring rain. He had questioned railroad workers who might have witnessed something unusual near the tracks. He had interviewed shop owners whose establishments stayed open late enough to observe the nighttime pedestrian traffic. He had even consulted with spiritualists and fortune tellers, desperate enough to explore any avenue that might yield insight. The new year had brought fresh hope that proved equally illusory. A tip from a concerned citizen led to the arrest of a vagrant who'd been seen near Piedmont Park, but his alibi was confirmed by a dozen witnesses at a downtown mission. A medical student fell under suspicion when a classmate reported his strange behavior, but investigation revealed only the eccentricity of genius, not the pathology of murder. By March, Morrison had begun to accept what his rational mind had long suspected, but his professional pride had refused to acknowledge. The Atlanta Ripper had either died, left the city, or possessed such perfect camouflage that detection was impossible. The investigation would remain open indefinitely, but active pursuit had reached the point of diminishing returns. The detective's superiors had gently suggested that his attention might be better directed toward cases with greater likelihood of resolution. Atlanta faced no shortage of crimes that could actually be solved. Robberies where witnesses existed, assaults where evidence remained, frauds that left paper trails leading to prosecution. The city's limited police resources could not be devoted indefinitely to chasing shadows. On a humid April evening, Morrison had made his final visit to the scene of Emma Lou Sharp's murder. The alley off Decatur Street looked ordinary in the fading daylight, no different from 100 other narrow passages that threaded between Atlanta's buildings. The bloodstains had long since been washed away by winter rains, and the cobblestones betrayed no hint of the horror they had witnessed. Standing in that quiet space, Morrison had felt the presence of all the unsolved mysteries that haunt every city like hungry ghosts. The Atlanta Ripper would join the ranks of those who vanished into darkness, leaving behind only questions that would never find answers and wounds that would never properly heal. The detective understood that his failure was not unique. Every city harbored secrets that law enforcement could not penetrate, crimes that existed beyond the reach of badges and warrants. Some predators possessed cunning that exceeded the tools available for their capture. Others benefited from circumstances that made detection impossible, despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators. As spring advanced towards summer, the city had begun to exhale the tension it had held through the dark months. Women ventured out alone again, though many still avoided the streets where the murders had occurred. The boarding houses filled once more with young workers drawn by Atlanta's promise of employment and independence. Life resumed its normal patterns, as it always does, with the resilience that allows communities to survive their darkest chapters. Morrison had eventually accepted reassignment to other cases, though he never stopped carrying the Ripper files in a corner of his mind. Every unexplained death in the city drew his attention. Every report of suspicious behaviour triggered memories of those terrible autumn nights. He had learned to live with the incompleteness, the professional wound that would never quite heal. The newspapers had published their final articles about the Atlanta Ripper in early summer, marking the one-year anniversary of Mary Elizabeth Crawford's death, with retrospective pieces that offered no new insights. The reporters had interviewed Morrison and other investigators, seeking closure that could not be provided. They had spoken with surviving family members who still grieved their losses and demanded answers that did not exist. Dr. Whitman had been quoted extensively in these anniversary articles, offering his professional assessment of what the murders had revealed about human nature's darker possibilities. The physician had grown philosophical during his months of examining the killer's handiwork, developing theories about the relationship between knowledge and evil that he shared with anyone willing to listen. Education does not necessarily ennoble, Whitman had observed during one interview that Morrison remembered clearly. A man may possess the finest medical training, understand the intricacies of human anatomy, and still choose to use that knowledge for unspeakable purposes. Intelligence and morality exist independently of each other, and we deceive ourselves when we assume that learning automatically produces virtue. The city had eventually absorbed the Atlanta Ripper case into its collective memory as one more chapter in the ongoing struggle between civilization and chaos. Atlanta had faced yellow fever epidemics, devastating fires, and the upheaval of war and reconstruction. The residents possessed the stoicism necessary to survive periodic outbreaks of inexplicable evil. Children born in 1912 would grow up hearing whispered stories about the autumn, when women feared to walk alone, when gaslight provided insufficient protection against predators who moved like smoke through the darkness. These tales would join the folklore of a city that had seen enough history to understand that some mysteries resist solution, despite humanity's best efforts to impose order upon chaos. Morrison had retired from the police force in 1920, his career distinguished by numerous successful investigations that had brought criminals to justice and provided closure to grieving families. But he never spoke of these triumphs without remembering the case that had eluded his grasp, the killer who had vanished into the vast anonymity of American life. In his final years, the former detective sometimes walked past the sites where the murders had occurred, noting how the city had grown and changed around these places of former terror. New buildings rose where old ones had stood. Fresh generations of residents replaced those who had lived through the autumn of fear, and Atlanta continued its transformation from a southern railroad town into a modern metropolis. The gaslight that had flickered over Emma Lou Sharp's final walk home had been replaced by electric street lamps that banished shadows more effectively than their predecessors. The narrow alleys where danger had lurked were widened or eliminated entirely as the city expanded and modernized. Progress had literally paved over the geographic memory of those dark months, though the historical record remained for those who cared to examine it. Morrison died peacefully in 1934, taking with him the burden of unsolved questions that had shaped his career's final decade. His personal files on the Atlanta Ripper case were donated to the city archives, where they joined thousands of other documents recording Atlanta's evolution from antebellum cotton center to 20th century metropolis. The files rested in climate-controlled storage, their leather bindings slowly aging, their photographs fading, their witness statements becoming historical artifacts rather than active evidence. Researchers occasionally discovered them while pursuing other topics, finding in Morrison's meticulous notes a window into both the investigative methods of early 20th century police work and the psychological impact of crimes that resist solution. The Atlanta Ripper case had become history, joining the ranks of unsolved mysteries that fascinate amateur investigators and professional historians alike. Books were written proposing various theories about the killer's identity and fate. Magazine articles explored the social conditions that had made such crimes possible. Academic papers analysed the investigation's methodology and the broader implications of serial murder in rapidly modernising urban environments. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The killer's identity was never determined. His fate remained unknown. Whether he had died, departed, or simply stopped killing was a matter of speculation that generated more theories than facts. The case existed in that liminal space where history intersects with mystery, where documented events dissolve into possibilities that can never be proven or disproven. Atlanta itself had moved far beyond those days of gaslight and terror, evolving into a major American city that attracted visitors and residents from around the world. The neighborhoods where the murders occurred had been transformed by urban renewal. Their character changed so completely that few traces remained of the world that had produced such fear. Yet in the quiet moments before dawn, when the city settled into temporary stillness, something of that earlier darkness seemed to linger in the spaces between buildings, in the shadows that even electric light could not entirely banish. History had many ways of preserving its secrets, and some stories resisted conclusion despite the passage of decades. The candle burned low in the archive chamber where Morrison's files waited in their boxes, patient as stone monuments. The electric lights hummed softly overhead, maintaining their vigil against the dark that pressed always at the edges of human knowledge. And in the silence between the turning pages of history, the Atlanta Ripper case remained what it had always been, a reminder that some mysteries choose their own time for revelation, while others rest forever in the shadows where they were born.